In this video, I will cover two main topics about Destined Death. However, I won't be addressing the nature of immortality in the lands between, the effects of removing Destined Death on the world, or how it differs from the immortality of the Tarnished. Instead, this video will focus on explaining two specific aspects: Unbounding the Destined Death and Fia's ending. Let's start with the first. I often see questions like, is there a low reason that Maliketh couldn't permanently kill us with the Rune of Destined Death? How can Maliketh not kill us permanently during the second phase? How? And the typical responses people give are things like, dying to a boss isn't a canon. The canon is that we beat them first try. So basically, any death to a boss just didn't happen. And the low reason is that dying to or post Maliketh isn't canon, suggesting that even fight with Gideon, Godfrey and Radagon all canonically done in first try. Or even I see excuses which just say game design and gameplay reasons. But is it really that simple as this redditor suggests? Short answer, no. Canonically, we still respawn after the Maliketh fight. Not every victory happens on the first attempt. Moreover, every death during the Maliketh fight count as canon too. Maliketh, even wielding Destined Death, cannot truly kill us. And there are many reasons to support this, especially when we examine the original Japanese translation. Now, here is the long answer. Unbounding the Destined Death. This is the single most confusing event in the entire game. So, what exactly happened after we defeat Maliketh? Enya, tell us.
The rune of death is unbound, and the lands between are shrouded by death's dark fate. But the flames will also burn the impenetrable thorns.
She implies that death is now unbound, as if it were previously confined to Maliketh's sword, and is now free to roam the lands between. But the Japanese phrasing has a slightly different implication. The rune of death is unbound, is written as Shino rune ga toki hanatareta to. While this could simply mean just the release or freeing of an object from restraint, however, toki hanatareta has a secondary meaning, often used to mean to unleash or to discharge a powerful force or energy contained within an object. It implies that the object has been storing something potent, and releasing it results in a significant or even overwhelming effect. For instance, a phrase like Kazan no chikara ga toki hanatareta means the volcano's power was unleashed. In Japanese, toki hanatareta often conveys the sudden release of energy that had been held back, resulting in an unavoidable impact, like a dam breaking or a TNT explosion. Once released, this energy erupts, creating a powerful, unavoidable effect. This is precisely what happens with the Rune of Death. We specifically release the red flame of Destined Death. The cutscene even shows the Rune of Death igniting in a burst of flame, almost as if it has exploded, instantly setting the Erdtree on fire. The phrase, the lands between are shrouded by death's dark fate, is translated well, but the Japanese includes a funny wordplay. We've just released Destined Death, which is Unmei no Shi, and as a result, the lands between are shrouded in Shi no Unmei, or the fate of death. This is Destined Death, just written in a reverse order, backwards, which is kinda interesting. Lastly, it's worth mentioning the meaning of shrouded here. The Japanese term oware translates as covered or enveloped. This term is often used to describe natural phenomena like snow covering the ground or fog enveloping a forest, meaning something physically covering an area. So, the phrase could be interpreted as the lands between are fully covered by the dark fate of death. Full coverage means it's something inescapable. Usually, people interpret this event as meaning that everyone will now die. However, the phrase actually states that the lands between are covered by a new, dark fate, not by death itself. This distinction is crucial. For the first time in thousands of years, the people in the lands between are witnessing true death, the death of the Erdtree. Imagine the one thing you've believed in for millennia dies right before your eyes. From this guy's perspective, this truly would appear as a dark fate. To quickly recap the point, we are not restoring death to the lands between. We are merely using the red flame of Destined Death to burn the Erdtree, and only the Erdtree. It's a one-time use thing. To fully bring death back to the world, Destined Death must be directly incorporated into the Elden Ring. Similar to how Mending Rune add new rules, Destined Death needs to be specifically embedded into the Elden Ring itself. No matter what we do with Destined Death in Farum Azula, we don't have the power to change the world's fundamental rules. Only the Elden Lord can make that kind of change. But there is more evidence supporting this idea. Unlike the Rune of Death, after defeating demigods or completing NPC quests, we receive Great Runes or Mending Runes. We physically hold this rune with us, allowing us to later embed them into the Elden Ring's formula. Only the Elden Ring can change world's fundamental rules. So unless the Rune of Death is physically embedded into it, true death will not return. If unbounding the Rune of Death is truly the same as bringing death back to the lands between, it would contradict all of the ending. If it worked this way, Destined Death would have a permanent effect unless something explicitly undid it. Gold Masks and Dung Eater's ending, for instance, wouldn't function at all if death were already unbound in the world. Gold Mask, as a devoted fanatic of the Golden Order, would never aim to create an order that included death. His perfect order would require an existence without death. This kind of order would be impossible to establish if death were currently present in the lands between, as it would remove fickleness of the gods. This means the recitation cannot simply be fixed later, not in the Age of Order at least. Dung Eater's ending faces a similar issue. It depends on the premise that people are reborn through the Erdtree. Instead of cursing individuals one by one, he curses the Erdtree itself, so everyone reborn through it will bear his curse. If true deaths were restored after Maliketh's fall, this plan becomes meaningless. You could argue that the lack of a Rune of Death item in our inventory means nothing, and that we somehow fix the death situation off screen later without it ever being mentioned. Or that, somehow, restoring death is embedded within other runes, for reasons. But honestly, that sounds way too far-fetched and extremely unlikely. Maybe I am missing some other clue that would confirm that unbounding the Rune of Death in Farum Azula truly returns death. But I just can't find any solid evidence for it. If you have any insights, please share in the comments. I would love to know why you believe death has genuinely returned. And since we are here, don't forget to like and subscribe. The strongest, but not final supporting argument for why unbounding the Destined Death didn't bring death back to the lands between lies in Fia's ending. If death were already restored, her ending would hold no meaning, because Fia's ending is, well, it's something we need to discuss in more detail. Maybe you find this approach to be boring or even too pretentious, but I say it regardless. The true meaning of Fia's ending was indeed lost in translation. However, this time the translation differ far more significantly than it did with the Unbounding of the Rune of Death cutscene. The Mending Rune of the Death Prince. A rune gestated by Fia, the deathbed companion, used to restore the fractured Elden Ring when brandished by the Elden Lord. Formed of the two Hellbrand half-wheel combined, it will embed the principle of life within death into order. The Golden Order was created by confining Destined Death. Thus, this new order will be one of death restored. Even though it explicitly mentions that death will be restored, which is unusual for Elden Ring, the most common interpretation on the internet goes something like this. Fia's ending doesn't restore death to the world. Those who live in death are simply no longer persecuted because living after death is now part of the natural order of the world. It sounds reasonable. So, what is the problem here? The first problem is with the final sentence. Thus, this new order will be one of death restored. In Japanese, the death restored part is written as Shino kaiki to naru de aro, which could also mean, thus, the new order shall become a regression to death. Here, regression is written using the same kanji as the law of regression, kaiki. The term kaiki usually means a return or reversion to a previous state, emphasizing a shift back to an original or primal condition. So, whatever Fia did here, it isn't something new, rather a restoring things to a past state. It was like this some time ago. We just revert the order to that state again. The order has regressed. Then what does it mean when it says, it will be embedded the principle of life within death into order? What exactly are the developers trying to convey with this phrase? The key phrase here is Shini Ikiru Kotowari. To break it down, Shini Ikiru implies a journey of living directed toward death. The particle ni in Japanese indicates direction or purpose, suggesting that life is on a path directly toward death. The example would be Umi ni iku, to go to the sea, Shi ni mukau, to head toward death. In each example, the particle ni establishes a destination or endpoint. Here, it emphasizes that life itself is directed toward death, a life defined by death at its final point. In simpler terms, we live to die. It emphasizes that life is a progression inevitably leading to death. By making the principle of life which leads toward death a core part of the order, Fia's rune implies that death is no longer an anomaly but a core principle. Under this new order, life and death are no longer separate, as they were under the Golden Order, but are now intertwined. Every life is destined for death, and every death in turn renews life. This redefined order represents a balance where life has death as its inevitable destination, embedding an ancient, perhaps even forgotten truth. Life gains meaning, precisely because it leads to the death. As for the reason why Maliketh couldn't kill us permanently, even with the Rune of Death, is actually quite simple. He just can't. Sekiro Dubio found an unused cutscene for Unbounding Destined Death, where when the red flame explodes we die. It's logical. Being at the center of an explosion that powerful would certainly be fatal. This unused scene suggests we can canonically die from Destined Death, but still live afterward. How? The answer is fairly straightforward. In the overtune of Elden Ring, Miyazaki explained that the Tarnished gained their immortality specifically from the guidance of grace. We died outside the lands between, yet grace granted us new life. He then compared this with the demigods' immortality. They don't seek the guidance of grace. Instead, their immortality is connected to Destined Death. So fundamentally, we just build it differently.
Farewell it is then. You'll be Elden Lord yet.